He was wonderful. It's a good story. I paid him $25,000. He was supposed to do 5 days' work from 9 to 5.
At 100, Mel Brooks has spent a lifetime making the world laugh. But behind those jokes is a man who never forgot betrayal and never tolerated an actor who disrupted his chaos. From Blazing Saddles to Young Frankenstein, The Producers, and Spaceballs, Brooks built an empire alongside stars. However, not every collaboration ended with laughter. Some actors tested his patience, challenged his methods, or brought egos onto sets where Brooks demanded commitment. And the shocking part? Some of these names are legends. So, who made it onto Mel Brooks' blacklist? And what happened that made a genius remember them decades later? At 100, Mel Brooks has nothing left to prove, but he may have grudges to settle. The one thing Mel Brooks could never tolerate. Mel Brooks ran his sets like a controlled riot. Every line had a beat. Every reaction had a purpose. Every pause was measured. He could tolerate eccentricity. He could even enjoy pure madness. What he could not tolerate was an actor who believed the movie belonged to him instead of the joke. In the world Mel Brooks created, there were only two kinds of performers: those who elevated the madness and those who got swallowed by it. The first group became legends. The second group became ghosts. He praised hundreds of actors publicly. He hugged them at awards shows. He told interviewers they were geniuses. But privately, he kept a different list. A quiet, permanent list of people who had wasted his time, ignored his notes, or walked onto his set believing they were bigger than the film. Once a name landed on that list, it never left. The higher he climbed, the stricter the rule became. Hire them, fire them. Hire them again if the comedy demands it. Fire them forever if the ego did. That was the rhythm of Mel Brooks's career. And 5 men discovered in very different ways exactly how permanent that firing could be. The philosophy was never written down. It lived in the rhythm of every production. Mel Brooks understood that comedy of his kind required collective surrender. The laugh had to matter more than any single performance. When an actor treated that agreement as optional, the entire machine risked collapse. Protecting the machine became more important than any individual relationship. That protection shaped every major decision of his career and left a trail of quiet exclusions that lasted decades. The rule applied without exception. Talent was necessary but never sufficient. Surrender to the larger rhythm was the real requirement. Without it, even genius became a liability. The 5 men who tested the rule learned that lesson in permanent fashion. Frank Langella, the Broadway statue who refused to fall. On paper, Frank Langella looked perfect, tall, charismatic, already celebrated for playing Dracula on Broadway to rave reviews. When Mel Brooks began developing Dracula, dead and loving it, Langella seemed like the obvious choice. He was Dracula, at least the serious version. That was the problem. Mel Brooks was not serious. He had zero interest in gothic tragedy or slow walks through candlelight. He wanted spit takes, pratfalls, a vampire who could deliver a dramatic monologue 1 second and slip on a candelabra the next. He wanted chaos wrapped in a cape. Langella walked into pre-production as if he were rehearsing a classical tragedy. From the first day, the tone was wrong. Rehearsals stalled. Brooks, who normally ran his sets like a circus that somehow stayed on schedule, found himself slowing down. Langella did not react to jokes. He did not improvise. He delivered every line like scripture carved into marble. Brooks tried everything. Notes, light nudges, new lines written specifically to force physical comedy. Nothing worked. Langella absorbed the direction politely and then returned to statue mode. Scenes that were supposed to bounce collapsed under the weight of every serious pause. The rest of the cast, seasoned comics and character actors, began to hesitate. Crew members started whispering the same question about whether the production was a comedy or an opera. One moment sealed the decision. During a test read, Brooks handed Langella a new line, a classic Brooks twist that began with high drama and ended in a pure pratfall. The response from Langella made the outcome inevitable. By the end of the week, Langella was gone. No shouting, just a quiet replacement for Leslie Nielsen. Nielsen understood the assignment completely. He played everything straight while the world fell apart around him. That was the energy Mel Brooks needed, not gravitas, control of the chaos. Officially, the change was called creative differences. Everyone close to the production knew the truth. Mel Brooks was never going to arm wrestle a Shakespearean statue into doing slapstick. Langella left quietly and never spoke about the experience. Brooks, for his part, never insulted him in public. But whenever, Dracula, dead and loving. It came up in interviews, he spoke about Leslie Nielsen with one word only: perfect. Langella's name was never mentioned again. In the private ledger, Mel Brooks kept Langella from wearing a crown. Mel Brooks was not making royalty. He was making chaos. And the fall had to be loved. The exclusion was permanent. The lesson was clear. Talent without surrender had no place in the machine. Gene Wilder, the soulmate who cut the thread. Some betrayals come from strangers. The most painful one for Mel Brooks came from a friend. Gene Wilder was not just another actor. He was the creative soulmate of Mel Brooks. Together, they rewrote what comedy could be. The producers. Blazing Saddles. Young Frankenstein. These were not merely hits. They were revolutions. The chemistry between them was so natural that unfinished thoughts could be handed across a table and finished as if the other man had already read the ending. After Young Frankenstein, something cracked. Wilder had written most of the script. Brooks shaped it, directed it, and fought the studio to keep it in black and white. The final film became an instant classic, but Wilder had a second script he believed in just as deeply. The Adventure of Sherlock Holmes's Smarter Brother. He wrote it, he wanted to direct it, and he wanted Mel Brooks to produce. Brooks said no. Not because the script was bad, not because it lacked laughs. He simply believed Gene Wilder was not ready to direct. Wilder took the refusal as betrayal. He expected support. Brooks gave him distance. That distance became silent. Wilder made the film without him. It featured familiar faces, Marty Feldman and Madeline Kahn. But the timing fell off. The warmth was fractured. For years, the two men did not speak. No public fight. No interviews full of hurt feelings. Just two former partners moving in opposite directions. The separation felt like watching a brother pack up and leave home, taking the best joke with him. They eventually reunited years later at an event neither expected to attend. There was no grand apology, no dramatic hug, just a handshake, a few careful jokes, and the slow return of something that resembled friendship. But something stayed broken. They never worked together again. Not because of anger, because of disappointment. Brooks once described Wilder as the only actor he ever trusted with his unfinished thoughts. After Smarter Brother, that trust never fully returned. Wilder had stepped outside the circle, and Mel Brooks, for all his laughter, never let anyone step out twice. In public, they remained affectionate and respectful. In the private world, Mel Brooks built on rhythm, instinct, and a strange kind of loyalty. Gene Wilder was the man who cut the thread. Not maliciously, but enough to leave a permanent scar. The scar remained visible in every future project that never included his name. Chevy Chase, the ego. Mel refused to invite. Mel Brooks had a sixth sense for energy. Before a single line was spoken, before a rehearsal even began, he could feel whether someone belonged. With Chevy Chase, that instinct screamed no. They never worked together. Not once. And that was by design. Chase's name came up repeatedly in the 1980s and early 1990s. Studios pushed hard for bankable stars. Chase had the box office clout, the perfect deadpan, and a household name. Mel Brooks shut the idea down every single time. Why? Because Chase broke the first rule of the universe Mel Brooks created. He did not play well with others. Brooks had watched him on talk shows. He had heard the behind-the-scenes stories. Chase was fast, clever, and scathing. He could make a room laugh and make it uncomfortable in the same breath. The impression left was of a performer waiting for everyone else to stop talking, so he could prove he was the smartest person in the room. Mel Brooks did not want the smartest person in the room. He wanted the most generous. Someone who could land a punchline and still leave space for someone else to take the final laugh. That was never Chevy Chase. The closest near miss came during casting for Spaceballs. Chase's name was floated for Dark Helmet. He had the voice and the dry delivery. Brooks barely entertained the idea. He wanted Rick Moranis. Rick knew when to step back. Chevy only knew how to interrupt. Privately, Mel Brooks described Chase as someone who crashed comedy instead of dancing with it. He admired the talent. He did not admire the way it arrived, always smirking, always slightly detached. Comedy to Brooks was not irony. It was a belief. No matter how absurd the joke, the performer had to mean it. Chevy rarely seemed to. There was one brief, stiff meeting. It ended with a polite smile and the quiet sense that the two men belonged to different universes. Chase never entered the universe Mel Brooks controlled. In the final tally, Chevy Chase was never blacklisted. He was simply left out. Not because he was not funny, but because he did not fit. And in the world Mel Brooks created, misfits were welcome. Chaos dressed as confidence was not. The exclusion was absolute and permanent. Harvey Korman, brilliance that came with resistance. On screen, Harvey Korman was golden. Mel Brooks trusted him with some of the biggest laughs of his career and received them every time. Blazing Saddles, High Anxiety, History of the World Part 1. Korman could nail a monologue, hold a ridiculous face just long enough, then let it collapse into pure comedy. Behind that brilliance lived friction Brooks rarely discussed. Korman came from The Carol Burnett Show, where he was the backbone of sketch after sketch. He was used to freedom, loose scripting, and a room that adjusted to him. The sets Mel Brooks ran did not work that way. Brooks directed like a conductor. Every line, every beat, every reaction had its assigned place. If someone strayed too far, the entire scene tilted. Korman strayed often. Their biggest clash arrived during High Anxiety. Brooks had cast him as Dr. Montague, the stuffy, sinister head of the Psychoneurotic Institute for the Very, Very Nervous. Korman wanted to rebuild the character from the ground up and write new tics. Brooks shut it down. The funny part had already been written. The actor simply needed to do it. Korman did not take the restriction well. Tensions rose daily. He paused between takes. He questioned blocking. He pushed back on online deliveries. Brooks, normally quick to riff, began cutting conversations short. What should have been a smooth shoot turned into a series of quiet negotiations. Crew members later described the atmosphere as passive warfare. They never yelled. They never fought. But every line became a small battle. By the final week, they were barely speaking directly. Notes went through an assistant. Korman was isolated during breaks. The energy that had once made Blazing Saddles bounce had turned rigid. The performance still worked. Korman was too skilled to let the tension show, but Brooks never forgot the cost. After High Anxiety, Korman's name disappeared from future Mel Brooks projects. Not from malice, from exhaustion. Some actors bring joy on set. There was no dramatic exit, just a quiet understanding that they had gone as far as they could together. The rhythm had broken, and Mel Brooks built everything on rhythm. The exclusion became permanent. Jerry Lewis genius, Mel admired from a safe distance. Mel Brooks admired genius. He had no patience for arrogance. In Jerry Lewis, he saw both and decided the combination was not worth the trouble. For years, their names were linked by genre. Both were comedic architects who wrote, directed, and starred in their own material. Studios periodically pushed for a collaboration, believing the pairing could produce something extraordinary. It never happened. And the reason was not a lack of respect for Lewis's talent. Brooks could recognize brilliance immediately. What he could not tolerate was the personality that came with it. Privately, Brooks called Lewis brilliant and exhausting. He respected the nutty professor. He respected the legacy. He did not respect the man. The breaking point came during the development of Life Stinks in the early 90s. The studio floated Lewis for a major supporting role, arguing that his presence would bring prestige and another layer of comedic credibility to the project. Brooks refused. He did not need someone who thought he was funnier than the film. That decision reflected something deeper about how Brooks worked. Lewis had a reputation for rewriting scenes on the fly, clashing with directors, and dominating every room he entered. Brooks did not share power, not in the edit bay, not on the soundstage, and certainly not when it came to the tone of a production. Still, the two men did meet once. A mutual contact arranged a dinner on neutral ground, giving them an opportunity to talk without a studio hovering over the conversation. Brooks arrived with curiosity. Lewis arrived late, launched into a long monologue about the future of American comedy, and barely acknowledged Mel at the table. Brooks listened politely, but the atmosphere apparently told him everything he needed to know. He left early. The impression left was clear. The other man did not want to collaborate. He wanted applause. After that, the idea was never seriously entertained again. Publicly, they stayed civil. There was no public war, no dramatic feud, and no need for either man to attack the other. Privately, however, there was no affection and no sense of a lost opportunity. There was only fundamental rejection. For Brooks, the issue was never whether Jerry Lewis was talented enough. He clearly was. The issue was whether that talent could exist inside an ensemble without consuming it. Mel Brooks built ensembles. He created chaos with balance. He let stars shine only if they understood the galaxy was bigger than any single performance. Jerry Lewis could not do that. His ego would not allow it. Brooks never gambled on someone who refused to trust the map. The exclusion was absolute. Once Brooks made that judgment, talent alone was never enough to change his mind again. The real reason Mel Brooks cut them off. Mel Brooks did not blacklist these 5 men because they lacked talent. Every one of them was gifted. He removed them because they threatened the one thing that made his comedy possible: collective surrender to the joke. In the philosophy Mel Brooks lived by, comedy was not a solo instrument. It was a temporary democracy of lunatics who agreed for the length of a scene that the laugh mattered more than any individual ego. When an actor treated that agreement as optional, the entire machine risked collapse. That is why the firings and exclusions felt so permanent. They were not personal vendettas. They were acts of preservation. Mel Brooks protected the chaotic ecosystem he had spent a lifetime building. Once an actor demonstrated they could not or would not live inside that ecosystem, Mel simply closed the door and never looked back. The public saw only the laughter. The private record shows something more disciplined. A man who loved chaos precisely because he controlled its borders. The 5 exclusions reveal a consistent philosophy that stretched across 6 decades. Talent was necessary but never sufficient. Surrender to the larger rhythm was the real requirement. Without it, even genius became a liability. This insight reframes the entire list. These were not 5 random conflicts. They were 5 illustrations of the same principle applied without exception. The principle remained intact at 100 years of age. At 100 years old, Mel Brooks still tells the old stories. He still laughs at the same gags. But the quiet list of names he never invited back remains intact. Frank Langella brought gravitas when Mel needed freefall. Gene Wilder took the trust and walked away with it. Chevy Chase arrived already competing. Harvey Korman brought brilliance wrapped in resistance. Jerry Lewis mistook the set for a mirror. None of them were untalented. All of them, in the eyes of Mel Brooks, broke the only rule that mattered. Mel Brooks never shouted. He never stormed out of rooms. He simply closed the door quietly, permanently. Some actors did not make the cut because they lacked skill. These 5 had the skill. What they lacked was the willingness to disappear inside the joke. And once trust was lost, there was no redemption arc. The actor was not merely out of the movie. The actor was out of the conversation. The list remains closed. The philosophy remains unchanged. At 100, Mel Brooks still protects the chaos that made him immortal. 5 gifted actors crossed an invisible line and never returned. Mel Brooks protected the chaos that made his comedy immortal. Talent was never enough without surrender. The quiet list remains closed at 100. Who almost made this list? Share thoughts below. Like and subscribe for more Hollywood Blacklist stories.